in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. All right, so good to see you all. So we're going to continue with Give Me a Word on page 175. All right, so we're on Longinos number 2. And so here's a quote from Abba Longinos. He said, once you become distressed, and he's speaking to a monk, by the way, he said the way to deal with this kind of inner difficulty and frustration is to tell yourself the following. He says, just say, be distressed and die. But if you ask me something to eat other than at mealtime, I will not provide you with the daily ration. So what he's trying to say is, if a person is struggling with bad thoughts, or like a thought to give into gluttony, for example. Of course, these are people who are doing extreme ascetical deprivation. But what they would do is they would say, "Oh yeah, if you're not happy with this fasting, then just die." And there's something that also like Saint Joseph Hesychast would do with his disciples. Like there's a story when Elder Ephraim was a young boy, and he was just becoming a monk under Saint Joseph. And once Elder Ephraim went to Saint Joseph and said, "Oh, I'm feeling a little sick. I don't know if I'm going to be okay." And then Saint Joseph says to him, "Well, get ready for the other life. You're going to die soon, maybe." So,
oh my gosh.
no pampering there. It's just like, so of course this is something that, I mean, it has its virtue that have that kind of mindset that, okay, we're just here to die, and the sooner the better. If it's God's will, I'll just go for it. So that's the sort of the spirit in which this is being said. And of course, as usual with the Desert Fathers, these things sometimes they're not easy to apply in a very literal sense to our situation, because especially for example, in terms of like just being okay with dying any old time, this is something that monks and nuns have a luxury of having that mindset, because they don't have other people depending on them. They don't have a family, or they're not taking care of their parents or whatever, and so they really have this kind of freedom to be completely focused on the other life. So even though this kind of attitude of, okay, I'm just totally okay with dying, I'm just going to keep struggling, people who are not monks can take this again with a grain of salt, saying, okay, it's this fighting spirit that I can benefit from, not necessarily this idea that, okay, I don't care if I die and let my family, my children figure it out after I'm dead, kind of thing, how they're going to survive. So that yeah. Okay, so now for the next story here on Longinos number 3 on 175 to 176 is sort of a entertaining story where this sick woman comes to Abba Longinos to get his prayers and his blessing, and then she comes out to the desert trying to find him. And she does find him, but she doesn't know who he is. So she said, "Hey, do you know who this Abba, this Father Longinos is?" He said, "What do you want that loser for? What do you want that imposter for? Don't go to him. Forget it." And then she said, "Well, I just need some prayers because I'm really sick." And then so he blessed her, and they said, "Okay, off you go. God is healing you, and don't think about Longinos. He can't help you at all." So she believed what he said, and she went her way, and she was immediately healed. But then it says afterwards she was told, she told people who she was trying to figure who was this monk anyway that healed me, and found out it was this Father Longinos. So yeah, it's just really beautiful just to see how much they loved just being low key and not being in the spotlight and not getting any kind of glory for themselves. Yeah, and then there's a beautiful line from the Psalms also. Oh no, that's good. Where it says, where the prophet David says, not to us, but to your name give glory. Prophet David says, because the prophet David knows that if in our current state of being susceptible to pride, if we glorify ourselves, if we receive glory from people, or we think highly of ourselves, it puffs us up. And when we're puffed up, then we end up losing God's grace and losing his blessings. So that's why it's so important to remember that all the blessings we have are really because of God. Okay. And then in the last number 5 here, in Longinus number 5, Longinus says, the woman knows she has conceived when her flow of blood is dried up. So too, the soul knows that it has conceived the Holy Spirit, in other words, become full of the Holy Spirit, when its flow of base passions is dried up. In other words, you don't no longer have any coarse desire, not only sexual, but also just any kind of pleasure or gluttony or anything like that. And it says, as long as it is immersed in those base passions, how can a person vainly boast of being, it says unfeeling, but apathis, that actually means dispassionate. And so it says, give blood and receive the Spirit. So one thing, this idea of apathia in Greek, this is taken from the Stoics, actually, this idea of where we want to rise above and transcend our desires, our passions, and that means any kind of sinful desire. And because that's a state in which we're free. And in fact, there's one thing we heard in the gospel reading this morning. Christ says, anyone who does a sin is a slave to sin. And this is something that unfortunately we all know from our own experience, what it's like. Oh, thank you. We all know what it's like to be enslaved to a sin, because when we have any person who habitually does a sin, the reason we do a sin habitually is not because we think it's a good idea, but it's because we just can't resist giving into it sometimes. And so in that sense, we're a slave to we're a slave to sin. And so this is what the Holy Fathers and also the ancient Greek Stoics also had the same approach. That we say we don't want to be enslaved to our desires. We want to be in control of ourselves. And so in Christianity, we take it even a step further than the Stoics. It's not just a matter of being free from passions, but it's also a matter of being united with Christ and having his grace with us. So this is what Abba Longinus is talking about here on page 176. Would you mind opening the door? Thanks. All right. So again, now we'll move on to page 177 and 178. And here there's a story of Saint Macarius the Egyptian, or also known as Saint Macarius the Great. And it's a story of how he was living near a village, but then there was some woman there who got pregnant with someone else, but then she accused him of being the one when it was, and so they really punished him, and they made him work hard to feed her and everything. But then when she finally, the time came for her to give birth, she couldn't give birth, and she realized her conscience was bothering her, that it's my own fault for not telling the truth, and so she admitted the truth. And then of course all the villagers were like, oh no, we slandered this holy monk unjustly. And so it says, now all the village wants to come this way in pomp, apologizing to you. They want to make a whole scene about how sorry they were. But then Saint Macarius says, yeah, but when I heard that, I got up and fled here to the Skeet, which is far in the desert, so people wouldn't harass me. And so again, it's this idea of we want to avoid glory, we want to avoid being treated honorably by them. And Christ says, woe to you when all men speak well of you, because Christ knows that we are so susceptible to praise that we can't hold on to it without getting puffed up. Oh, Mary, do you want to just scoot a little bit that way?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes,
That's okay. Sorry. Okay. And now the next one here, 178 to 179, the same Saint Macarius says that some people came to him, some monks came to him for some advice, and they said, "Oh, Holy Father, tell us a word, give us some advice." And then Abba Macarius says, "Well, who am I to speak to you? I haven't really become a monk yet, but I've seen monks." And then they're like, "What do you mean you haven't become a monk? You've seen monks?" He says, "Well," he says, I'm not a real monk like these other monks I've seen in the." Then he goes on to tell the story of these two monks he found who were just living in an island in the middle of a lake, and they just had nothing at all, and they were just so they renounced everything, and they did this so that they could be not distracted by anything. And they had reached this supernatural level where they wouldn't even need clothes to keep warm in winter, or not get burned by the heat in the summer. And even for food, they would just barely have to survive. And it just, this is something we constantly see in the lives of the saints, how these monks would reach these supernatural levels of grace. and forgive me, I'll just say this one more time because it's just so funny. It's stuck in my mind. It is the story of when I once confessed I know I've said it already a couple of times, but there's once a 14-year-old kid whom I confessed and back in Arizona, and he was a very pious kid. He obviously was raised in a very good family, and at the end of the confession, he says, "No, I want to be when I grow up." I said, "No, what?" So I want to be a monk. And I'm like, "Oh, well, that's a very noble thing to do. But why do you want to be a monk when you grow up?" He says, "Because monks have superpowers." And so he wanted to be like like the X-Men or the Marvel, Anyway, so.
Did he end up becoming a monk?
Well, I don't know. I lost touch with him. It'd be very interesting to know if he did, and if he had superpowers too. But I did, of course, explain to him that, yeah, okay, well, it's true that it's much more likely to get superpowers if you're a monk than in a lay person, but still, it's still a lot of work, so don't count on it. Yeah. All right. So anyway, so now moving on to page 179, number 3. Yeah, and so here's a very powerful, insightful story about how it is that how the devil tempts us. And so Saint Macarius was at this level where he was able to actually see the demons. And that's something that God usually doesn't allow people to see, simply because the demons are so scary looking and so terrifying. In fact, the Holy Fathers even said that, if you had a choice of like jumping off a cliff that's super deep and just breaking all your bones, or jumping into a furnace where it's like 1,000 degrees Celsius, or looking at a demon, you definitely choose one of the first two. You would, it's just so terrifying. Even just the sight of them is just so bad. And that's why God doesn't allow us to see them, just because we just freak out. It's like worse than the worst horror show kind of thing. And yeah, and in fact, God even, they even say that God, even when we do see a demon, even then we don't fully see the demon's entire ugliness and terror of and in fact, another thing the Holy Fathers say about the presence of demons is that even if you don't see a demon, but if there is some demonic energy or something, or just the presence of a demon, it's something that just brings you this intense feeling of terror, like your hair is standing on end, and just like you just feel it in your bones that this is like very yeah. So anyway, but God has allowed many of the saints to see the demons, because and I think it's because they have so much grace from God that they're able to encounter demons and not be just totally wiped out and freaked out by this sight of this, something that's the demon's so terrible. And yeah, go ahead.
Why are the demons so grotesque looking if they were once angels? Is it just the fall did that to them? Or do you
Yeah,
know?
because so as you probably know, the demons, they weren't created to be demons. They were originally angels in heaven, and Satan himself was Lucifer, the morning star, the brightest and the most beautiful and amazing of all the angels. But he fell into pride and wanted to be above God, and so he also tried to convince all the other angels, let's rebel and be above God. We don't, who needs him, kind of thing. And so because of this prideful rebellion, they were immediately cast out of heaven, and they lost all their grace. And so, there's a saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, kind of thing. So like, so the Lucifer, and Lucifer, of course, is actually a positive name originally, because it's from, there's Latin for light. Yeah, light. Yeah. So but he became the darkest of the dark, and so did all the other angels that fell and became demons. And so I guess it's this, that because they were given so much, they just, that's how further they fell. Yeah.
So is it because of us being made in the image of God that we haven't necessarily lost the complete amount of grace
Yeah.
that they did, or have we actually fallen that far? We just don't quite realize.
Yeah. So the fall of man, of Adam, and also our individual falls are much less severe than the demons' fall, because when the demons fell, they just went from 100 to 0. They didn't have some bit of repentance, some bit of humility, some bit, whereas when we fall, and when Adam fell again, as well, that we and Adam have, we're aware of this fall, and we have repentance. And in fact, there's in the hymnography of the church, it talks about how Adam, after he was cast out of paradise, would just sit outside the Garden of Eden, and just be just there weeping and weeping and thinking, oh no, I lost paradise. And Saint Cyril the Athonite, he even went further. He wrote a whole long, like a 10-page poem about how Adam felt after he lost grace and fell out of paradise. And he says things like, oh, even though the Garden of Eden was so beautiful and so wonderful, that's not what I'm really weeping about. What I'm really weeping about is the fact that I've lost my closeness to Christ, to God, and I no longer have that connection with him, and I've grieved him, and that there's the relationship has been wounded in this way. And the way Saint Cyril writes about this, it's so powerful, because Saint Cyril was writing this actually out of his own experience, because Saint Cyril, he also, as being human, he also had mistakes in his spiritual life. There was a time when he started getting prideful, because he was getting so many graces and gifts from God that he started in an imperceptible way getting a little bit puffed up. Of course, by our standards, the kind of pride Saint Cyril had was like 0.001, but even though for us, his kind of pride would be our kind of humility, actually, but because God expected so much more from him, because he had been given much. Christ says, from him to whom much has been given, much will be demanded. So because God had such high expectations of Saint Cyril, even that slight little bit of feeling, oh, I'm pretty good, that was something that made him lose a lot of grace. And so Saint Cyril was able to write from his own experience what it's like to be close to God, and then to lose that connection, and then be far from him. And so, yeah, so if you ever get a chance to read that book about Saint Cyril, it has also the writings of Saint Cyril, and it has that he wrote. It's called Adam's Lament. It's where he's crying outside of paradise. So, yeah, and so to answer your question, the reason why we don't become like the demons every time we fall is because we do have some repentance, and even when we do give into some sin, the reality is that that's only some part of us that wants to sin. There's another big part of us, or at least medium-sized part of us, that really doesn't want sin and that really does want to connect with God and please him and follow Christ's commandments. And so that's why our falls are much less harmful to us as compared to the demons. Okay. So anyway, getting back to page 179, what happens here is that Saint Macarius sees Satan himself, and he's walking by disguised as a human being, but he seemed to be wearing a garment and with a whole bunch of holes, and on each hole there is a little flask, a little bottle hanging on each hole. And so then Saint Macarius said to the Satan, he says, "Where are you going?" And the Satan says to him, "I'm going to jog the memories of the brothers. You know, I'm gonna remind all the monks of all of their sins, of all the sinful things they might have heard or seen or whatever." And then Saint Macarius says to him, "And what are all these little bottles, these little flasks you have on you?" And he says, "I'm bringing victuals for the brothers. I'm bringing something for them to taste." And he says, if and the reason I have so many different kinds of little bottles is because if one of the monks doesn't like this one, I'll offer him this one. If he doesn't like it, I'll offer this one. And so what he's referring to, of course, is the pleasures that can come from all the different sins. So, for example, one monk might be very impervious to judgmental thoughts or sexual thoughts or gluttonous thoughts, but he could get angry really easily. And so then the demon will come and fuel that passion. And this likewise for the other monk. He might have, and that's generally how all of us are. I mean, we all tend to have one passion that's really the strongest, and that's our biggest struggle. And I think the reason why it's like that we generally don't have just a little bit of all the passions, but we have one particular passion that's really strong, is because of the way that the demons fight us. So, for example, well, first I say this. Remember how when we read Abba Dorotheos, he was saying that if a hunter is hunting birds and he has a bird trap laid for a bird, and let's say a bird got its toe stuck in the trap, but the rest of the bird is free, it's not in the trap, well, it's not really doing the bird any good that its entire body is out of the trap if its one toe is stuck in the trap, because that means the hunter can come anytime it wants and just knock it dead. And so the same thing happens with the passions. You know, if we might be, you know, perfect, a saint in every single aspect of our life except this one passion, and that's the one that demon gets us and is constantly hitting us, and we're in trouble. And so when we're judged, you know, we when we're going through the toll houses, if there's one of these toll houses that we're really failing at, you know, we're in great danger to lose our salvation, even if everything else we're perfect and holy. And so the demons know that. Yes.
Sorry, what you're talking about now with passions, if we will never 100% beat them. So our Lord, does he just want, like, you know, instead of doing it 100%, we're doing it like 50, and he sees us struggling. Now, you said with the toll houses, will that help us along the way? That, you know, for example, if I was a person who judged a lot, and, you know, I tried every day to correct myself and be mindful of it, and even though I still did it through this toll house that you just discussed, will the Lord say, you know what, Ioana tried, she fought her as much as she can. Yes, she did it, but she confessed, she repented. Will that help our souls along, even though we don't accomplish it 100% and we get down to 40 or 30 or even 60 or 70?
Yeah, definitely. And you know, there's one of the things that Saint Isaac the Syrian said. He said something very interesting. He said that if God took a person out of this life, in other words, the person died before the person reached perfection, but God saw that they were on their way to perfection, well, then God will put them with the perfect. In other words, put them in heaven, because he saw where they were going. It was just a matter of time. And so the same thing with us. So, you know, if we are genuinely trying and struggling to overcome our passions and gradually making a little bit of progress, well, then that's enough in God's eyes, because God isn't a stickler. He's not going to say you have to be perfect. I mean, So there is salvation for us, even if we're not perfect yet.
Oh, Father,
Yes, Tim.
sorry, I'm at a gas station, but I'm paying attention generally. The one thing I missed was, what was Satan in his disguise doing besides carrying the bottles? There was something else you mentioned he was doing?
So he was just walking. He had a bunch of holes in his garment, and
Oh, yeah.
there was a flask hanging from it.
Yeah, I got that part, but wasn't he doing something else? Or was that the whole point of the
No,
story? Okay,
well, there's more coming to the story.
okay,
So
sorry.
yeah,
Father,
yes.
Prabhatram, maybe he means the victuals, the little things that.
Oh yeah. So he says
Thank you.
the flasks. He's when Saint Macarius asked what were all those flasks, those bottles. He says, "I am bringing victuals for the brothers," and so victuals means food, something to eat.
Yeah,
So,
and those were the different passions, right?
yeah.
Oh, but there wasn't something else as a general program he was doing besides that. That was the whole one and only thing.
Yeah, so that's all he was doing.
Oh, okay.
But then the story continues, and
Okay.
and then he says, I'm gonna go now to the monks and try to give them this.
Uh-huh.
And so then off he went, and then after Satan went to the monks and was walking back, he again passed by Saint Macarius, and he said, well, in the Greek it says, in the Greek there was a typical sort of standard greeting monks always would say to each other. They would say, "May you be saved, Sophis." And so when Saint Macarius, it's sort of like saying "Eυλογείτε." You know how now we always say "Eυλογείτε" when you see a monk. And so when Saint Macarius sees Satan, he says the ancient version of "Eυλογείτε," which is "Sophis." You know, there's literally "May you be saved." And the Satan says, "What do you mean? How can I be saved? How can I be?" This translation not very good. It says because "How could I be well?" But it's like, "How could I be saved? What are you talking about? And how can I be well?" And then the elder said, why aren't you well? And he says, "Well, all the monks there were savage with me. They weren't, none of them were giving in, and no one received me." And then the Saint Macarius said, "What, you didn't even have a single monk there who received you?" He said, "Oh, well, there is one monk that's friendly with me, and whenever he sees me, he just like a leaf in the wind. I just blow him here and there." And then Saint Macarius says, "What's his name?" And the saint says, "His name is Theopemptos, the monk Theopemptos." And so then after the Satan said this, he went on his way. So then, of course, Saint Macarius, so he's not gonna just what? Yeah, of course, yeah. So then Saint Macarius goes down to where all the monks are, and then when the monks heard, "Hey, Abba Macarius is coming," you know, he's this great elder, it's like this super Gerda's coming, and so they're all, you know, cleaning up their house, hoping that maybe he'll come to stay with them. But then it turns out he asked for Father Theopemptos, and they're like, "Oh man." But anyway, but then they go. So he goes into Father Theopemptos, and he says, "So how are things with you, Father Theopemptos?" He says, "Oh, thank you. Through your prayers, I'm well." But of course, Saint Macarius knows that he's not. He's you know, he's covering up what he's really struggling with, and he says, "Well, aren't you having thoughts that are troubling you?" And poor Father Theopemptos says, No, so far so good." He's too embarrassed to speak out. It's sort of like, you know, how we are confessing. I remember even this once with Yarn Frem. There's this guy who was telling me how he went into confession, and he did a good confession. He confessed most of the things he confessed everything he had to say except one thing. And then at the end of the confession, Yarn Frem said to him, "So is that everything?" And the guy was like, "Yeah, I'm good. That's everything." And Yarn's just like, are you sure?" I'm like, yeah, I'm good to go. Yeah. And then Yarn said, "Well, what about this?" And he said exactly what the one is that this poor guy was too embarrassed to confess. And the guy, "Yeah, okay, yeah, I did that too, yeah." Yeah. Yeah, it is scary. Yeah.
You can't
I-
find anything from you.
Yeah, and I was terrified too, because I don't know, when I first started being the elder from cell attendant, I had heard all these stories. Oh, I'm thinking like, I gotta live with this guy now, and he's gonna be like seeing every bad thought I have all day long.
I have this question, like, did it happen like Año Macario with Papa Fem, or did it happen like Ayeirini? Which
What?
in Ayeirini, the angel would come and tell the sins of every person.
Yeah.
And Año Macario, it would be the devil actually sometimes
Oh.
confessing.
Did you guys hear what she said online? Oh, okay. Well, she's just saying that there are times, for example, in Saint Irini Chrysovalandu, her life, there was she was the abbess of a monastery, and in order to help her sisters, help her nuns, in other words, she asked God to have the gift of clairvoyance so that she could see what their thoughts are, and so that they wouldn't be able to sneak around and whatever. And so God did send her an angel, and the angel would tell her whatever the thoughts are of these sisters. But then there's also other times in the lives of the saints where the demons would actually reveal to someone what someone else did or said or is thinking. Not that the demons know what we're thinking, but they can have a pretty good guess. For example, if it's a Friday and they throw a thought at you as you drive by McDonald's, oh, there's cheeseburgers in there. And if they see your saliva starting to go, then they know, okay, this guy's a glutton. Let's work on him in this passion, So the demons can have a sense of what we're thinking, even though they don't know for sure. But in terms of Yaranda Frem, so to answer your question, I was really worried because how am I going to even breathe if this person is constantly seeing every single time a bad thought comes. And so like even just a few days after I started being a cell attendant, I said, Yaranda, can I ask you something?
I don't know already.
Can yeah, and he answered my question before I thought no. So I said, Yaranda, can you see my thoughts like all day long? Yeah. And he said, oh, no, my child, that's not how it is. It's only when God reveals it to me that only then will I see know someone's thoughts. I was like, oh, okay, phew. Okay, I can do this.
But did he pray for that, or was it a gift because of his virtues?
Did you hear that question? No, yeah, sorry, you're too far away. So she just asking if Yaranda had received. Well, you better hold on to it over there. So because she was asking if Yaranda had that gift because he had asked for it from God, or if it just sort of came to him. And that's a good question. I never asked him that question. I don't know how he got that gift. Yeah.
Did you ask him how it works?
No, and that's the other thing. And because in the life of Saint Ephrem of Katanakya, who is a little bit older than Yaranda Ephrem, but they're both disciples of Saint Joseph of Hesychast. This Saint Ephrem of Katanakya, he also had the gift of being able to see thoughts, and if you haven't read the book about him, it's really fascinating. I encourage you very much to get it. And anyway, in this book, he talks very honestly and plainly about this gift of clairvoyance, how it works. He says sometimes it works like I just have I see something, or I hear something, or I even smell something. So, for example, once he got a letter in the mail, and as soon as he got the letter, he's like, "Ooh, well, this letter reeks. What is this?" And it wasn't. And the other people like, "Well, we don't smell anything. What?" And then he opened it up and he realized that this person who written the letter had committed some really bad sin. I think it was like black magic or something. Anyway, so it was something that he would actually smell. He would have. And in fact, Saint Joseph the Hesychast, he also had that very interesting gift as well. One day Saint Joseph was just walking down the path at Mount Athos, and he came across some laymen, and he smelled something really awful coming from this layman. And so Saint Joseph said, who are you? Oh, I'm just so and so. I'm a chanter at the church, or just some pious Orthodox Christian. And Saint Joseph says to him, there's something very, very wrong with you. I don't know what it is right now, but we gotta talk. Can you come by my cabin someday? And the guy's like, oh, well, sure, yeah, okay. So he comes by his cabin the next day, and they have a talk. And then Saint Joseph realized that this guy believes in Darwin's theory of evolution. In other words, that God didn't create the world, or God didn't create man. He created monkeys that just sort of turned into people. Anyway, so which of course is a heresy. And so, but Saint Joseph was able to actually smell it. And so, yeah. So it is something that sometimes you smell, they would smell it or see it or hear it or something. Yeah.
So all the senses were in
Yeah.
It's like it wasn't only the thinking part, like
It wasn't just like a thought.
just a thought. It was just like all the senses were like in full in its peak of understanding. Like,
Yeah, and I give you some other examples from Saint Ephrem of Catanakia. So, for example, one time he was serving liturgy for Saint Joseph, and of course Saint Ephrem was younger, and Saint Joseph was his elder. And Saint Ephrem was starting to have thoughts like, well, wait a second, how can I say in liturgy, Irini Pasi, how can I say peace to you when I'm saying it to my holy elder, as if he doesn't have peace and I have peace? So he was really troubled by this thought. It's like, it just isn't right. I can't do this, And so, but then as he was really struggling with this thought, he heard a voice coming out of the Petrahili, the stole, the priest's stole, saying, it's not you that's saying peace be to all, it's I'm the one saying it.
Oh.
So in other words, it's not the Petrahili, not the piece of cloth, of course, but it's God's grace, of the priesthood that's saying this. So yeah, another time he actually saw it with his eyes. Like, for example, when so at first Saint Ephrem of Catanakia for decades was with the old calendarists, which were the zealots who were not in communion with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And Saint Joseph the Hesychast was enlightened to see that these zealots had gone overboard and were taking this stance of the calendar way too, they're overemphasizing it in a way that's borderline heretical. And so Saint Joseph left the old calendars, but Saint Ephrem wasn't free to do so until his elder died. And so he continued serving and commemorating the old calendarists, but he noticed that while he was doing liturgy and commemorating the old calendarists, sometimes he would see like mice droppings on the altar table, even though they weren't really there. It was just a sign that there's something wrong with this liturgy. But then when finally he was able to commemorate the Patriarch of Constantinople, and no longer the old calendars, he no longer saw ever mouse droppings on the
that's
altar.
again his vision.
Yeah, it was his spiritual vision.
Yeah, spiritual vision.
Yeah, so there's just an example of how his gift of clairvoyance was something that he actually saw with his eyes at times, or sometimes he heard, or sometimes he felt or smelled. Yeah.
Could you perhaps talk a little more about that? Because if I remember right, it's like Saint Joseph was going along with some of the old calendar stuff, and then he went back to his cell. He saw a demon. Went, "What are you doing here?" The demon said, "I don't know. You invited me." So he got rid of him, and then realized that it was because of the old calendar stuff.
So what happened was, so Saint Joseph the Hesychast, when he went to the Holy Mountain, and he was just a very young man and not really experienced in church matters, he soon found out that there's different groups of people on the Holy Mountain, and there's one certain group of people that they call themselves the Zealots. And he's like, oh, that's a good group to join. I'm zealous too. I want to be zealous. That's got to be the best kind of monk to be. So he hooked up with the Zealots. And so, but then after being with them for years, he realized that, wait a second, these Zealots, they're he understood that the zealots doesn't mean that they're the people who take their salvation most seriously and fight with a lot of zeal for their salvation, but rather they're people who are so concerned about the change of the old calendar to the new calendar that they view it as a heresy. And later they even said that people who are on the new calendar have no grace. And not only that, but he also thought that the old calendarists were becoming very extreme. So in almost crazy ways. For example, he was talking about it in some of his letters. He said that these old calendars, they're so stuck on these details that they'll do these crazy things. For example, there's an idea that we should never step on a cross out of reverence for the cross, which of course is a good principle. So, but then they say, but then these zealots, because they're so much against stepping on a cross, that if they have to go to a place where there's two roads crossing, they won't be able to walk across it. They'll have to go around, so they're not stepping on a cross. And they also said there's this other thing they had this idea that, okay, well, the chalice is something so holy, it's something so heavenly that it should never touch anything earthly. So instead of having it on the altar table, they would have it suspended above the altar, like on strings or something. And it was like, where did they get this? You know, it was just ridiculous. And he listed several things like this. Exactly. That's the whole thing. So Saint Joseph saw that these zealots, they weren't just zealous for their salvation, but they were overzealous for these trivial details that are secondary or not even secondary.
So that even through his own discernment of I need to leave this,
he
still knew that it was okay for Saint Ephrem to carry the cross. No, remain obedient to your elder. We'll deal with it later. You fight that fight, but I need to step out.
Yeah. So what he was saying was, so Saint Joseph had this vision that the old calendars are like this tiny little rock in the middle of the sea, and that the new calendars are like this huge mountain. And so he found himself on that little rock with the waves getting dangerously higher and closer. And so at one point he just jumped off onto the mainland rock and he was all good to go. And so Saint Joseph realized that this was a revelation from God to show him that he needs to leave the old calendars to go to the mainstream Orthodox Church. And so, but then in terms of your question, because the tricky thing about Saint Ephrem of Katonakia was that the person who made him a monk was Father Nikiforos, who is someone who was dead set in being old calendarist, but this Father Nikiforos allowed Saint Ephrem to go to confession and for spiritual guidance to Saint Joseph. So Saint Ephrem was in this awkward position of having his spiritual guide and elder, one person, Saint Joseph, but his practical sort of daily kind of living with elder being this Father Nikiforos. And so when Saint Joseph went to the new calendarists, Saint Ephrem of Katonakia, of course, also wanted to go, but his elder was dead set against this, in no way. And so Saint Joseph said, okay, well, said to Saint Ephrem, well, since your elder is dead set against it, you can't disobey your elder. So be patient and be obedient to him until he passes away, and God will accept this as a struggle, and you're covered by obedience, and you're okay. And so he did. But the thing, it wasn't just like for a couple of years. It was like 30 years or something. He had to be patient. So Saint Ephrem was just like a tremendous saint of patience. It just incredible.
But he saved his elder soul.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
So Papa Ephrem, because of his obedience, even though it was wrong, because he was obedient, the Lord saw this as a struggle, because he was, again, obedience is the most important thing, especially to your spiritual father. So even though his spiritual father was with the old calendarists, and this is wrong in the eyes of the Lord, the saint's obedience and struggles saved him in the end, even though it was wrong what he was following.
Yeah, and there's a very important quote from the Old Testament that says this was when Saul he took so there's the prophet Samuel, and the prophet Samuel told Saul defeat these foreigners, that they should not keep anything of the spoils to themselves, but just destroy absolutely everything. But when after Saul won the battle and saw the spoils, all the whatever gold or whatever nice things, he said, "Oh, that's actually pretty good. I could take some of these things and I could even use like these really good cows, I think it was there, and a sacrifice to God, because they in the Old Testament they would sacrifice animals to God, and that was what the priests would do. And so Saul thought, okay, I'm not gonna obey what God said, what through the prophet Samuel, but I'm gonna do what I think seems for right, and it's for God. He justified, he rationalized it. So, but then because he did this, he actually lost a lot of grace from God, and the prophet Samuel said, inspired by God, he said, obedience is greater than sacrifice. And so that's something just straight out of the Old Testament. And then the church fathers, especially the monastic ones, would take this and explain that yes, in this still applies nowadays too, that it's more important to be obedient to your elder than it is to do some great ascetical struggle or whatever it is you're going to do. And so so that's why, even though
Papa Fran, sorry, the video totally cut out. I didn't hear the last 30 seconds. It froze completely. I don't know if it froze for anybody else, but I couldn't hear a thing.
Oh, really? 30 seconds. Oh my. Okay. So did you hear about
It's where you said obedience is greater than sacrifice, and then it cut out.
Oh, okay. So what I was saying is that the prophet Samuel was telling Saul that he can't disobey God and take the things that he was commanded to destroy, use them as a sacrifice to God. But so God told him through the prophet Samuel, obedience is greater than sacrifice. And so this is something that the Holy Fathers also explained applies nowadays as well. It's more important to be obedient to your elder than to go out on your own and doing some great fasting or praying 24 hours or whatever it is. If you're not covered by obedience, you're not blessed by God.
So
Yeah, go ahead, Lenny.
a question on that.
Yeah.
Obviously levels like Yaranda Frem and different, like Saint Joseph the Hesychast. How did it work for them when they got to a certain level that their elder passed? Then how did they go to confession at certain, because they were still human? So who did they have to, or was it just at that point they had so much grace that they had a direct connect to? You know what I mean? Because who would? I always would wonder that, like, who would confess to heaven, or who would,
Yeah. So a good question. So the thing is that everyone needs confession, no matter because we're all even even if you're so for example, Saint Joseph the Hesychast, after his elder passed, he found Saint Ephrem of Katanake. So and even though Saint Ephrem was quite a bit younger than Saint Joseph could see the holiness in this disciple of his, and this Saint Ephrem of Katanake, he was a priest, and so Saint Joseph would confess to his disciple, Saint Ephrem. Okay. And so also like Yaron Ephrem too, after his elder Saint Joseph passed away, he would confess to other priests. So for example, for many years he would confess to Saint Joseph, Father Joseph, the one who was at Portaria for very many years, and twice he got so desperate he confessed to me. but it's very scary too. It's like it says, he says to me on the phone, come upstairs and bring your peterchili, I want to confess to you. Like how am I supposed to hear Yanda's confession? And so that he confessed some things that were, and for me would have been like so trivially small that it would be like I wouldn't even probably remember to confess them. And then then it says, okay, now read me the prayer for absolution. So I put the stole on his head and read, and then he says, now give me your hand and I can kiss it. And I was like, oh come on, this is torturing me. How do you do this? So bad, because how because I always kiss his head. He never kisses mine. I just told upside down. Anyway, that just goes to show what kind of humility he had.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there were.
Yeah. So we all need.
And that was especially to show you the importance of
Well,
confession.
I mean, maybe it was a
You
lesson for
and the
me,
rest of the-
but I'm sure it was just not. I got the sense he was doing it not just because he wanted to teach us a lesson, but just because it was something very natural. Because I mean, he really genuinely wanted to confess something because he was confessing with a lot of contrition, and it wasn't just like some sort of show he was putting on.
Sure,
So
sure, not to show, but
yeah,
maybe to show, no, not to show, but this action really represents what he was preaching all the years. Like
yeah.
that this is what we are. Like if we don't confess till the last minute.
Okay. Sorry, you need the.
Sorry for my
Yeah,
so
yeah.
If we don't confess, because he saw himself as not the way we see him right now.
Yeah, of
So he
course.
thought that he's a sinner, like
Yeah.
everybody else, you know.
Yeah,
And it was natural for him to confess. It's not that he was doing
of
it
course.
just
Yeah,
to show. Of course, I didn't mean that, but I meant to say that Christ said that in order to be, you need to serve. You know, in order to, like, he wanted to be the greatest example, like Christ. You know,
Yeah.
it's like as well.
yeah,
Christ didn't need to wash their feet. Christ didn't need to do like stuff that what
yeah.
we're supposed to do.
Yeah, and I got the sense that for Yaranda, I don't think he was consciously thinking, okay, I've got to make a good example for everybody.
No.
It was much more along the lines of, yeah, I'm just gonna live the way my holy elder taught me to live, and then of course doing that would naturally be a tremendous example for everybody. Yeah.
What's that quote from St. Joseph? It's like repent, say the prayer, find humility. That's it.
Say that again.
There, do you remember?
Uh,
the quote? Sorry.
Yeah.
There's a quote from St. Joseph. It's something like, repent, say the prayer, have humility. Only this will get you through until the end, or something like that.
Yeah, yes. I mean,
Yeah,
it
there's a
does
million
sound like
quotes.
very much like what he said. I can't remember off the
Yeah.
top of my head, but yeah, that is very much because the truth is we don't need a lot for salvation. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, for example, the idea of having continuous repentance, that's a very simple thing. It's very hard to do, and same with constant prayer. I mean, it's easy in concept, but to actually do it and to actually be humble, that's not so easy.
And especially for elders. I know this thing.
I did get another one just for you.
Christos Anesti, Papa, I have a question.
Oh, yeah, okay.
One second, but for elders, I
Oh.
bet it's a lot harder to keep humility.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I guess for someone like Yaron de Frem, he had the huge blessing of being humbled so often by his elder, Saint Joseph, that he really drilled it ingrained it so deeply, and it was something that he was able to hold on to that sense of his nothingness and his lowliness, so that he wouldn't get puffed up even later when he would get honor and authority and all that.
That makes me wonder if Saint Joseph did that to Saint Ephrem and Miguel de Ephrem. But Saint Joseph wasn't treated like that by his Is
Oh,
that the power of what we're capable of handling? What Christ is having for us in the future?
yeah. So it's true. Saint Joseph was especially strict with Yaron de Frem, and it was definitely because Saint Joseph was a master of being able to size people up and seeing what kind of spiritual medicine, what kind of behavior would be beneficial. Because the truth is, being really harsh with some people would just make them fall into despair and give up and whatever. Whereas he could see that Elder Ephraim was so patient and could bear this, that he would do this kind of thing. Yeah.
Even though he was like so he was a tiny little human being.
Yeah, he was short and weak. Yeah. Yeah.
Even though he saw the
fighting spirit,
the mountain
yeah.
of grace inside him that he's gonna gain from all this.
Yeah, and in fact, even and Saint Joseph even said about one of his other disciples, Father Charalambos, Saint Joseph would be so harsh with poor Father Calambos. He would just be insulting him, and he would even get to the point of saying, "Yeah, and the reason you're like this is because of your father who passed away. He's why you end up being such a whatever." And poor Father Calambos was saying, "Oh, yeah," he was sort of saying in his memoir, saying, "Oh, Yaranda, why'd you even have to go there? You attack my father of blessed memory. He was such a holy man, and for my elder to be railing on him, oh, that's a rough one. But I'll be patient. I'll be patient." And Saint Joseph, the Hesychast, on his part, would say, "Wow, this Father Harlambos, he's like one of those super donkeys. You can just load him up with everything, and he'll just bear it all." So these people, so Saint Joseph knew when to be harsh, but of course he also had his very tender side in people that needed that kind of tenderness and leniency. So
Was it any of his disciples? I don't think so.
probably.
But his letters are very loving.
Yeah, so it all depends on I mean there's a time for harshness and time for
But the other thing was not like that.
so Yaron
That's
Frem,
great.
but actually no, I mean so I only got to be with Yaranda in the 90s, which was after he was already in his mid 60s. But the fathers at Philothea were telling me that, oh wow, you guys you have it easy now with Yaranda Frem. Now he's old, he's softened up. When he was a young elder, oh my goodness, it was harsh. It was really rough being with him. He wouldn't let us eat like only once a day, and only at the end of the day. And if we did one thing wrong, we'd get punished so hard. It was yeah. So he did soften up. Yeah,
You can see the icons of Saint Joseph, like you can see that he's a strict,
Yeah.
but the other time you can see.
Oh no, he would have his strict side. I mean, in fact, he would even do it on 10. I mean, I tell you the time. There's one of the things he did to me once. I remember because he would give us these homilies about prayer, about obedience, about silence, whatever. And one day, on one of the occasions, after a few days after his little homily to the monks about silence, I happened to be in the kitchen with 2 or 3 other monks, and one of them asked me some question about something, and I started going on and talking about it. And as I was blah blah blah, all of a sudden Yaranda Frem walks in the kitchen, and he sees me talking, and he says, "Oh, I told you, you think you're so smart, showing off everything, telling the fathers like, oh, Evlogius, Yaranda. Yeah, you say Evlogius, but you're not correcting yourself. Yeah." I just got on and on. I'm just like, oh, Yaranda, I'm thinking, oh no, I upset my Yaranda. What have I done now? So I'm just totally like, oh. So I'm like, oh. So then he walks by me after he chewed me out. But then the other monks are back there, and so as soon as he walked by me, he all his anger, and as soon as I couldn't see his face, all his anger and just instantly disappeared. And he had this just childlike, beautiful smile on his face. Of course, I didn't see it. The other fathers saw it. They told me afterwards. So
you can feel better a little bit.
yeah, because I thought I was just like, oh.
So he upset you that you made him upset.
What's that?
He made you sad and you made him
Well, of
upset.
course. How can you not be upset if you make your elder upset?
That's probably.
Well, it's fear of Yaranda. It's not fear of. Yeah. So yeah. So it is.
Not that you saw him as the
Yeah.
That's how we should be
Yeah.
towards everybody and towards God lately.
Yeah. So
How do you gain that?
what? Oh well, I mean, if you.
How do you gain that?
So
over?
yeah, so I mean, there is one of the sayings of Saint Anthony the Great. He said, if you want to learn how to fear God, go live with someone who fears God, and just by being with him, you'll absorb it. And this is something that I think it's true for a lot of virtues, because if you live with someone who is, for example, very prayerful, it's gonna rub off on you whether you like it or not. You'll just see how prayerful the person is, and it just sort of naturally sink in. So yeah, but of course, I mean, if you're not becoming a monk or a nun, you can't really choose some holy elder to live with, but at least you can pick the people you do spend your time with, and because there is that saying, I suppose something like this,
Mixing with the foolish.
yeah, tell me who your 3 friends are, or 5, tell me who your friends are, I'll tell you who are. Is that how it goes? Yeah.
So true.
Yeah, and so that's true. So if you hang out with people who are just living a very worldly life, you can be trying to keep on track spiritually, but it's going to be a real uphill battle, and you might be being pulled down into worldliness in ways that you yourself don't even notice. And so yeah, that's why it really does matter, with whom we hang out and spend time.
So how do you differentiate that from saying that we have to talk to everybody?
Oh,
Like, how do you differentiate that who you're gonna pick to have your 5 conversations here?
yeah.
And then when people just wanna talk to you.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then,
So,
you gotta
well,
waste spend some time, and then if they wanna
yeah. So
be around.
I guess just saying hello to someone who's worldly doesn't make you worldly.
Not just,
but-
but they start.
But if you
trying to-
start spending time and hanging out and doing things together, and yeah, so the more time you spend in that kind of atmosphere, it will. So I think it would be wise to limit your interaction with people if you see that they are pulling you down in a direction that's going to actually harm you. Oh, actually, it's time to go already. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it. Okay, well, thank you for all your questions. So we got up to page 180, it seems. Yeah, so 180. So we'll go. Let's try going up to 190 for next week. Okay. And so next week we'll be back on schedule. So not this later time, but 10:30 Chicago time. All right. All right. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tomb bestowing life. All right.
Amen. Thank you, Father. Hey, Father,
Yes.
would a shorter than last week call work today?
Yeah, I think so. I'll see. We'll try.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Father. God bless you.
Everybody.
Thank you,
Los
sir.
Anesti.
Thank you,
Father.
Papa.
Déjenos en este.
Alitos Anesti.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. A quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
My question is, what happens when those people want to be your friend, those worldly people continue to seek you out because they feel like you're helping them, but like you said, if it's not helping you, what do you do?
Yeah, and so this is where having a spiritual father help you make that discernment can be helpful. But if you can't ask him, well, then you can sort of try to see, okay, how much am I being pulled down by these people, and how much am I lifting them up? If I'm just being pulled down in just a very slight way, but they're receiving tremendous benefit, okay, well then yeah, I can choose to make that kind of small sacrifice, and that's fine. Or on the other hand, if you see that they're really pulling you down and really getting you away from a spiritual way of life, and they're not really benefiting all that much, well then that'd be a wise time to say, I got to limit or just cut these people off. It's just not working.
So it's not bad to do that.
So no, it's because the Holy Father say if you see a drowning man, you should give him your cane, not your hand, because if you give him your hand, he can pull you in and then 2 people drown. But if you only give him your cane, you can let go of your cane and only 1 person drowns. And so the idea is, yes, we want to love all people and help all people, but we have to also be aware that we're not going to lose our own salvation trying to help other people. Yeah.
Sorry, just have you heard about this concept of neural mapping? This concept of
neural mapping.
That we're like, it's more modern science, more modern psychology is talking about this ability that humans have to pick up energy from others. From just like if let's say they're depressed and you're around someone who's constantly depressed, immediate, or I should say, as soon as someone who's deeply depressed walks into the room, that there's a sense of that. And Elder Porphyrios in his saying has talked a little bit about that. But now they're saying there's actually neural mapping. It was
been proven that it exists.
Been proven that you can actually absorb. So maybe even at that level, that's a very kind of shallow level.
Yeah.
But yet, from a neurophysiologic perspective, that you can actually pick something up. I don't know if you've heard of that.
No, I heard something along those lines that that a person's state, it is something that affects you. And in fact, they even shown something with heart rate variability, that if you're in a collected state and there's someone else who is in a disturbed state, and they can measure this in terms of the variability of your heart rate, and then the people touch, actually the skin touch each other, then the person who's in a good state can convey his good state to the other person who's in a bad state.
Really?
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
they've actually measured that.
But
Yeah.
the worst thing is the opposite
I think
happens
that-
as well.
Well, so according to that study, it goes the good way.
goes to the-
But I'm sure in terms of these other things like the neural mapping, I wouldn't be surprised if someone who's in such a like a dark state can sort of bring a whole cloud over the whole room and make and many of them. I also remember in some monasteries, one nun was telling me, yeah, this one nun, as soon as she walks in the room, it just like this dark cloud enters, and we're just all like. Yeah, so it must be that neural mapping thing where it is something that happens.
Metropolitan Neophyto has talked about a certain hierarch from overseas has talked about how quantum mechanics is going to begin to play, and he's actually approved not only like Byzantine chant and mathematics and some of the other things we taught in the schools, but also quantum physics. And he wants quantum mechanics and quantum physics to be really understood, so that after the times that are coming, that's going to be a primary focus for catechism and for the church moving forward. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I didn't know that quantum physics is something that was that this bishop sees as being spiritually important. I guess I'd be really curious to know what aspect of it is that he sees that's so important.
He's basically, if I understood correctly, because obviously it's all through translation, right? But essentially what he was getting at is a lot of what we see in the early teachings of the church and all continuing now can somewhat, if not fully, be explained through quantum physics, quantum mechanics.
Wow.
So as people begin to bring their logical minds of, okay, I think this is it, but what does this look like? How do we do this? How do we throw this into the realm? If the Orthodox can understand the quantum side of things, we might actually be able to bridge the two.
Yeah. So I mean, it makes total sense that these science that as science progresses, it's constantly turning out to be proving things that we already know through orthodoxy, because we believe that our reality that Christ taught us and the Holy Fathers taught us, it's something that it's that science also will show in time if we have enough evidence or whatever the way to measure it. So, but in terms of actually learning quantum mechanics, I mean, that might be, I mean, I've never tried to learn it myself, but I'm guessing that it's probably above the ability of most people to learn, but that's not something we need to necessarily worry about, in the sense that, all the saints of the church for the past, I'm sure none of them, or none, but most of them did just fine without knowing exactly why things happen. For example, why or how is it that they have these revelations of clairvoyance or anything? Whereas if you have this, knowing quantum physics will be much more helpful, I think, for someone who needs to have some sort of rational proof in order to believe what what the Orthodox Church teaches.
And he had used it in the context of, he was told by St. Jacobos, one day your sermons will be heard across the world. Well, how's that possible? Well, I don't understand it. Go talk to St. Porphyrios, or go talk to Uncle Porphyrios. Right? He gets this stuff.
Yeah.
So he used to come in that realm, right? Not everyone's going to understand quantum mechanics, but those of you thinking about going into science, if you're drawn to that sort of thing, look that way.
Yeah.
As being the reason that it's explained in Revelation that everybody will know what is Christ. That, I mean, that's a conversation he had in December of 2023, the one you're talking about. So when it was like, to the point was that because the most logical human beings won't understand what Christ did for them, that's why it will be explained like that. Not for the more sensitive other side of the beings who understand Christ in a hard way.
Like in a logical way.
Yeah, because that's the other thing, is that we don't need to have science in order to be saved. I mean, we can be saved perfectly fine without knowing anything at all about science or anything about why it is that prayer works, or why, but for many people, especially as time passes, many more people, there are more and more people who, if they don't have a scientific explanation,
They won't
they're not
read
ready to accept it. So in that sense, probably, I'm guessing that's what.
That's the purpose of the
Yeah.
speech he had
Yeah.
when he was explaining that, because I remember I actually had to hear it like 2 times in order to understand that. I'm back to it.
For
Yeah,
us Western English speakers.
it's difficult because it also gets translated after like a long time. Yeah, Morpho, you're talking about Morpho, right? Okay. So yeah, because he also says that he's a very logical human being. He needed more evidence in order to understand things as a person. But then Christ spoke in his heart through his elders, so it was different. But again, as you said, like we really need to do the first step of are we ready to discover something? Because that's the thing. Either the quantum physics ways or the supernatural ways or whatever ways. We gotta do the first step of wanting to do this.
Yeah.
That's the I think that's the most important. And God will find a way.
Father, I had a question I wanted to ask you, but I know we're wrapping up. So can I just email it to you, please?
Oh yeah, or you can ask me now. If you, by the way, you guys need to go. Feel free to step by. It's not. I'm not offended at all because it is getting late. But yeah, what you can say now if you like. I'm okay.
It's okay. I know that we're beyond our time, but I'll just email it to you.
Okay, you sure? Because maybe other people now are all curious. They don't know what you're gonna ask.
Yeah. Don't keep us in suspense.
Okay, none of la Yemeno. My question is that you talked about obedience earlier. So how do we practice joyful obedience to our spiritual father?
Yeah. So, well, I guess so. Obedience is always supposed to be something voluntary in the sense that you're choosing to obey, and so most of the time, the things that our spiritual father will tell us are things that that they're in line with also how we understand our spiritual life, and they make sense. It's like going to the doctor. Most of the times when the doctor tells you advice, you're happy to hear the advice because it's something that you realize you understand is good for you. But sometimes the doctor or your spiritual father will tell you something that actually is challenging, it's hard, and you might not be very eager to do it. And so in that case, yeah, it can be a little bit of a struggle to convince yourself that, okay, wait, I'm going to do it the way my spiritual father says, even though I would rather like something else, or I'm a little hesitant. And I guess one of the most helpful things to remember is the principle that's emphasized again and again and again in the Holy Fathers of how when we're obedient to our spiritual father, that's when we receive God's blessing, even if the specifics of what our spiritual father says might not be ideal. So for example, if our spiritual father says, oh no, yeah, don't do 50 prostrations every day, metanias, do only 10. And so you might know that, well, wait, for me, 50 is just like so easy, and 10 is like, it's like doing nothing. I'm not exerting myself, it's not an effort. But I'm going to be missing out on extra grace or whatever by only doing 10 instead of 50, which rationally speaking could be true. But the thing is that, again, obedience is greater than sacrifice. So by obeying your spiritual father, you're doing what's humble, and then you're going to get even more grace. And so that's to remind ourselves of that is very, very important. Do you want to say?
Also, Efrem, I had read a book. I'm reading actually. I'm on Ayo Efrem Katunaki. He wrote a whole thing about being obedient, and what helps me, and I can help our sister in Christ, is that he said that Christ speaks through our spiritual father. The mouth of our spiritual father is the mouth of Christ. Whatever your spiritual father says is like the Lord is saying it to you. So every time your spiritual father says something, you have to remember that it's Christ telling you in that moment, because Christos, like he enlightens your spiritual father, and he's the one it's the Lord who's telling you in that moment. So our whole thing in our life is to please our Lord. So it's something that you can keep on your mind. Okay, my spiritual father told me this. No, the Lord told me this, and I want to please him. It's something that I do personally, and it works amazing.
Thank you. Yeah. Of course, it does get a little challenging when I mean, that's going to work 99% of the time, and that's fine. But there are going to be times, rare exceptions, where a spiritual father might actually say something that goes against Christ's commandments. And Saint Basil the Great warns us that if our spiritual father ever tells us to do something against the commandments of Christ, we need to obey Christ and not this person who's telling us to go to do something against Christ. So,
But if we're ignorant, how do we know?
so if you're ignorant, how do we know? Well, it's for the most part, yeah, you guys are okay, bye, nice seeing you. Yeah, for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, if your spiritual father says, okay, do some sin, okay, well, obviously, but the thing I say, it's 99% of the time you're gonna be fine, because in general, a spiritual father is not going to tell you to do something that's prohibited by Christ.
But sometimes it can be also like very fine line. He won't just tell you do the sin.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
He might even like guide you the right way.
Yeah, and so that's where it does get a little. It's true. There is a gray area in some of these things, because a spiritual father might, tell you to do something that's not directly a sin, but sort of indirectly against the commandments of Christ. And so that's why it can be really challenging. And that's why also St. Pius would say that in his experience, it's not enough just to have one spiritual father for all your questions, all your guidance. From time to time, it's important to have, it's helpful to have some other person just to get a second opinion on, sort of like, doctors too. You can go to your doctor and he can do almost everything he says, but occasionally you might question if he's really saying something like, hey, you get a second opinion from another doctor, and that's okay.
But when it's not against the command, but in general, everything, isn't it you get more grace if you're being obedient? Just say your spiritual father is wrong on a topic, and it's nothing to do with the commandments of the Lord, because that's kind of common sense. I mean, if you're not going to go, go steal and that, but if you are obedient to your spiritual father, and even though he's wrong on something, I've read again from the Ayo Ephraim Katonakia, he said that you will get grace because of your obedience.
Yeah, in general, that's the principle to follow in general. But again, there is some gray area where there can be times when it really would be better not to obey your spiritual father. It's something there's some red flags or something, something serious.
I think the example he used was, or maybe it was Yaranda, planting the onions upside down. Yeah. And so that's like obviously not affecting your
Or like when the spiritual father is telling you something from God is when yourself is telling you don't listen to him. That's exactly when you know that it's what you should do.
Yeah, unless of course it's the part of the passionate part of you is like your spiritual father says, you gotta keep the fast, and there's a part of saying, no, don't do it.
That's when it's the guarantee that the spiritual father actually make the spiritual father.
Can I just ask, maybe to touch on a little bit on when do we, as struggling in the spiritual life, is there the process of spiritually maturing as well, where yes, just like a child, it has its parents, and the parent is to guide them through their life, but at some point the child is to grow up and also be able to mature and make decisions. And doesn't this apply also in the spiritual life, not omitting the spiritual father or the guidance, but when do we reach that level where we are not actually babies until we're in our old age latching on? So if you can touch a little bit on that.
That is important, but there's a very interesting story that Saint Ephraim of Katonakia, who is emphasizing obedience so much, he talked about good disobedience. And so Saint Ephraim of Katonakia said, imagine this, suppose there's an elder who has two disciples. One's just a newcomer, he's just a very young monk or a novice or something, and the other is a monk who has been his disciple for at least 15 years. And so let's say that this elder says to the young new novice, says, sing a worldly song and dance, which is of course totally inappropriate for behavior in a monastery. And so Saint Ephraim is saying that if the novice says, may it be blessed, and he sings a worldly song and starts dancing, that was the right thing to do. And then he said, if the same elder says to his older disciple, who's been a monk 15, whatever, 20 years, sing a worldly song and dance, the correct answer for this older disciple would be to say something like, oh, excuse me, Yanada, I'd rather not. And
Or
so,
I don't know one.
oh, no, well, yeah. So in other words, what the point is that in the beginning, and there's especially in monasticism, it's expected that a person really should be, as I say, blindly obedient. That's the most beneficial thing to do, just to totally cut off your will and to really learn how to obey, even when it doesn't make sense to you. But then after you grow up and you understand the spiritual life much better, and you have a sense of the principles, well, then after 15 or 20 years of obedience, of cutting off your will in a blind sort of way, well, then you have acquired the grace and the discernment to know when to be blindly obedient and when to say, oh, I'd actually rather not do it like that. So yeah, and that's the other thing, is that the purpose of having an elder and being obedient to him isn't just to become dependent on him and not be able to function without his blessing and guidance, but the whole purpose is for you to become mature yourself. And so that's why the challenge of every spiritual father is not to make carbon copies of himself, but to form the image of Christ in this unique person, and for him to become the unique person that Christ wants him to be.
So it's very hard to be a spiritual father because every single person has a different
Yeah.
Sorry, Papa, if I didn't understand that. So you mean you have to make your own decisions? Shouldn't you still ask for guidance from your spiritual father, even when you reach maturity, if you're troubled by things? Or should you rely on your own?
No,
if you need?
No. So that's not what I meant. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that, so for example, I'll say that there's a very well-known bishop in Greece, Metropolitan Nikolaos Hadji Nikolaou. He's someone who's, he's super smart. He's had decades of experience. He's been a monk on Madapos. He's lived with Saint Paisios. He's been gone on to top universities. But even though he's sort of the top in his field and also top in the spiritual world, in terms of he's a metropolitan of a huge place, even he has a spiritual father, and he goes to him and gets blessings from him. So for example, if he has the idea, I think I'm going to visit America and go on a pilgrimage to a monastery there, instead of just doing it, he'll call up the spiritual father and say, hey, I'm thinking of going to this, is it blessed? And then the spiritual father will say yes or no, and then he'll do it. But and in fact, he himself told me this, because he was pointing out that even though we, after being decades in working and living as in the monastic life for this, we already have a good sense of what's right and wrong. That still doesn't mean that we can't get blessing and shouldn't. I mean, in other words, we should get blessings, because getting blessing from a spiritual father, it's not just a matter of permission, but it's also even God's blessing. It shows humility, and it's a much safer way. And so even if we have much experience in the spirit, living the spiritual life for decades, it's still to our benefit to get a blessing, even if we know what the answers are going to be. Yes, Tasso.
I'll try and finish with this question, but it's like this initial blind obedience in like the monastic life and just like life in general. Is it like another way of also showing humility, and like a way to humble yourself a little bit?
Yeah. Could you hear that online? Yeah. So yeah, it is. So that's the real point of obedience, is because we want to acquire humility, because with humility, everything can go well in our spiritual lives, whereas without humility, we can't really hold on to any spiritual virtue, anything good. And so that's the key. You're right. It's in order to acquire humility, we want to be obedient, especially in the beginning with blind obedience. So you guys have to go. I feel bad for you guys.
No,
you're okay.
We feel bad.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But these are good questions.
Thank you. I'm sorry I asked it too late. I apologize.
Oh, no, that's okay, because people kept jumping in. That's good. I'm glad. All right, well, should we call it a day? Okay.
Let's call it.
All right. Thank you for all your good questions. I'm gonna turn off the recording now.